People like to believe heroes are born fearless, but the truth is far simpler. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is stop walking. The wind carried the sharp scent of scorched metal across the gray valley as Daniel Carter climbed over the shattered remains of a transport drone, every careful step sending loose fragments of crystal rock sliding down the hillside. The emergency lights on his weathered engineering suit blinked amber instead of green, warning him that both battery reserves and life support were running lower than he wanted to admit. Behind him, the distant horizon glowed beneath a sky split by pale blue clouds that shimmered with strange electrical currents, while far above, broken pieces of orbital stations drifted silently like forgotten islands. Hours earlier, this valley had echoed with alarms, engines, and desperate evacuation calls. Now only the wind remained. Daniel adjusted the worn utility pack resting against his shoulders and checked the cracked display attached to his left wrist. No communications. No rescue signal. No navigation satellites. Just static washing across the screen in endless waves. Figures, he muttered under his breath before stepping forward again. He had come to this frontier world to repair freight engines, not survive disasters. Yet survival had a way of rewriting every job description. The ground beneath his boots bore countless deep impressions left by creatures that had swept across the valley earlier that day. Whatever had happened here, it had happened fast enough that families, soldiers, and workers had abandoned everything. A child's toy lay half-buried beneath silver dust beside a collapsed supply crate. A tiny blue scarf fluttered gently from a bent antenna, moving with the breeze as though someone might return to claim it. Daniel paused only long enough to pick up the scarf and brush away the dirt before carefully folding it into one of his cargo pockets. Maybe someone was still looking for it. Maybe someone was still alive. The thought pushed him onward. Every few hundred feet he called out, his voice carried away by the endless plain. Anybody out there? Only silence answered. Then came something different. Barely audible. So faint he almost convinced himself it had been the wind slipping through broken machinery. A tiny sob. Daniel froze. He listened again. Nothing. He took another cautious step. There it was. A child crying. The sound drifted from somewhere beyond a ridge of overturned cargo containers where twisted support beams leaned against fractured stone. His heartbeat quickened. He moved faster now, weaving through scattered debris while scanning every shadow. The closer he came, the quieter the crying became, as if whoever made it had nearly run out of strength. Reaching the far side of the ridge, Daniel stopped completely. Between two crushed containers, beneath a sheet of bent alloy plating barely large enough to create shelter, sat two small figures pressed tightly together. Their blue skin reflected the cold daylight with a soft glow, and wide golden eyes stared back at him without blinking. The older child, a boy no older than 8, instinctively shifted in front of the younger girl, spreading both arms despite trembling with exhaustion. The little girl clutched a small stuffed creature, missing one stitched ear, while tears traced silent paths down her cheeks. Neither child spoke. Neither tried to run. They simply watched the unfamiliar human standing several yards away. Daniel slowly removed his gloves and knelt so he would not tower above them. He kept both hands where they could see them. "Hey," he said gently, his voice calmer than he felt. "My name's Daniel." The boy swallowed hard before answering in careful English through shaky breaths. "Mom said, if strangers came, we should hide." Daniel nodded once. That was smart. The little girl looked up at her brother before whispering something in a language Daniel did not recognize. The boy hesitated, then met Daniel's eyes again. "She wants to know," his voice cracked. "If you're leaving too." Daniel did not answer immediately because promises carried weight, especially in places where hope had already been abandoned. He looked at the frightened boy, then at the little girl clutching the worn stuffed toy with both hands as though it were the last familiar thing left in the universe. Finally, he nodded once. "No," he said quietly. "I am not leaving." The words settled over the small shelter with surprising calm. The boy lowered his arms just enough to study the human's face, searching for signs of deception. Whatever he expected to find was not there. Daniel slowly reached into one of his cargo pockets and removed a sealed emergency water pouch. He placed it on the ground instead of handing it directly to them, allowing the children to choose. The little girl glanced toward her brother. After a long moment, he carefully picked up the pouch, examined the unfamiliar label, and offered the first drink to his sister before taking one himself. Daniel noticed that simple gesture immediately. Even now, the older child thought about protecting someone else before himself. "What are your names?" Daniel asked. "Elio," the boy answered. He rested one hand gently on the girl's shoulder. "This is my sister, Mira." Daniel smiled faintly. "Good to meet both of you." Mira managed the smallest nod, though tears still clung to her bright golden eyes. The silence that followed was interrupted by a low metallic pulse echoing somewhere beneath the valley floor. Daniel frowned. It was not thunder. It repeated every few seconds with mechanical precision. He activated the cracked scanner mounted on his wrist. The display flickered several times before stabilizing long enough to produce a rough terrain map. Large sections remained unreadable because of damaged satellites, yet one warning flashed across the screen in bright amber letters. Multiple biological signatures detected. Estimated count, 300. Distance, 4.8 miles. Direction, northeast. Estimated arrival, less than 1 hour. Daniel's jaw tightened. The scanner struggled to classify the approaching life forms, but the growing cluster of moving signals told him everything he needed to know. Whatever had emptied this valley was coming back. He quietly dismissed the warning before either child could read it. There was no reason to place fear on shoulders already carrying too much. Instead, he scanned the surrounding landscape with careful eyes. The overturned cargo containers offered temporary cover, but no lasting protection. The nearest rock formation stood nearly half a mile away. Beyond them, a narrow maintenance tunnel cut through the ridge according to the outdated survey map stored in his engineering database. If the tunnel remained intact, it might provide enough shelter until rescue arrived. That was a dangerous word to believe in. Rescue. His communicator had remained silent since the orbital collapse. Still, Daniel refused to accept that silence meant the end. Somewhere above the clouds, someone had to be searching. Elio noticed Daniel studying the horizon. "Are they coming back?" he asked softly. Daniel looked at him. "Who?" Elio swallowed. "The ones that chased everyone away." Daniel considered the question before answering. "Maybe." He refused to lie. "Then we should leave," Elio whispered. Daniel stood and adjusted the straps on his weathered pack before extending one steady hand toward the children. "That is exactly what we are going to do." Mira slowly reached for his hand without speaking. Her tiny blue fingers disappeared inside his rough human palm. For the first time since he found them, she loosened her grip on the stuffed toy just enough to take a single careful step towards someone she had never met before. The three of them moved carefully through the silent valley, their footsteps softened by pale gray dust that covered broken machines and scattered cargo containers like early winter snow. Daniel stayed a few feet ahead, constantly checking every corner before signaling the children to follow. His engineering scanner remained clipped to his wrist, refreshing every few seconds with a faint electronic tone that seemed louder each time it echoed across the empty landscape. The number of distant life signatures continued climbing across the damaged display. 300. The estimate had not changed. Only the distance had. 4.2 miles. For miles. 3.8. Whatever was moving across the valley was doing so with relentless purpose. Daniel spotted an abandoned maintenance vehicle leaning against a fractured support tower. Most of its outer frame had been crushed, but the emergency compartment remained sealed. He hurried over and forced open the hatch with both hands. The hinges protested with a long metallic groan before finally giving way. Inside rested a portable flashlight, 3 thermal blankets, an emergency medical kit, and 2 ration packs. "That is our lucky day," Daniel said with a tired smile. Mira watched him carefully as he handed each child a thermal blanket. "Mom always said lucky days come after the hardest ones," she whispered. Daniel looked at her for a second before folding the last blanket over his own shoulders. "Your mom sounds like a smart person." Mira smiled for the first time. It lasted only a moment, but it was enough to remind Daniel why he had stayed. Elio unfolded one of the ration packs, studying the unfamiliar earth markings. Daniel knelt beside him and demonstrated how to break the safety seal. Warm steam drifted into the cold air as the self-heating meal activated. The smell of vegetables and herbs spread gently through the quiet valley. Neither child complained that it was different from their own food. Hunger had erased such concerns hours ago. Daniel waited until both children had eaten before taking a few bites himself. His stomach reminded him that he had skipped 2 meals already, yet watching the children regain a little strength mattered more. As he packed away the empty containers, another sound reached them. Not loud, not close. A deep, rhythmic vibration carried through the ground itself. Tiny fragments of stone danced across the surface with every pulse. Daniel slowly stood. He did not need the scanner to know the moving signatures had drawn nearer. The display confirmed it anyway. 3.1 miles. Estimated arrival, 47 minutes. His eyes swept toward the distant ridge shown on the old survey map. Somewhere beyond those weathered cliffs waited the maintenance tunnel. If decades of erosion had not collapsed it, they still had a chance. If not, he refused to think beyond that. "Can you both keep walking?" he asked. Elio nodded immediately despite obvious exhaustion. Mira looked down at her small boots before quietly answering, "I can try." Daniel reached into his backpack and removed a length of climbing rope. After looping it loosely around the pack resting on his shoulders, he smiled at Mira. "Then today you do not have to try alone." He gently lifted her onto the reinforced cargo frame attached to his backpack. It had once been designed to carry heavy engine parts across construction sites. Today it carried something far more important. Mira wrapped one arm around his shoulder while still holding her stuffed toy against her chest. "Is this too heavy?" she asked softly. Daniel adjusted the straps and rose to his feet. "I have carried heavier engines than this," he replied with a grin. "You are much better company." A quiet laugh escaped Mira before she quickly covered her mouth in surprise. Even Elio smiled. For just a heartbeat, the valley no longer felt abandoned. Then Daniel looked once more at the flashing scanner. 2.9 miles. He slipped the device back onto his wrist, tightened the straps on his pack, and fixed his eyes on the distant ridge glowing beneath the pale blue sky. "Stay close," he said calmly. "From this point on, we keep moving together." The climb toward the ridge became steeper with every passing minute, and the strange blue light filtering through the clouds slowly faded into the muted silver glow of approaching evening. Daniel could feel Mira growing heavier against the reinforced cargo frame, not because she weighed much, but because every step demanded more from muscles that had already carried him across miles of broken terrain. His breathing settled into a steady rhythm, while the cooling fans inside his engineering suit hummed softly against the quiet air. Beside him, Elio refused to complain even as exhaustion slowed his pace. The boy kept glancing over his shoulder, listening to sounds that Daniel could barely hear. Another alert flashed across the damaged scanner. Distance, 2.2 miles. Estimated arrival, 33 minutes. Daniel shut off the warning tone before it could echo across the rocks. The less noise they made, the better. Ahead, the narrow entrance to the maintenance passage finally came into view, half concealed beneath a collapsed communications tower whose twisted framework leaned against the cliff like a giant skeleton. Relief lasted only a heartbeat. A section of the tunnel entrance had caved in years before, leaving only a narrow opening between fractured slabs of stone and bent alloy supports. Daniel walked forward, shining the recovered flashlight into the darkness. Dust floated through the beam like tiny stars. The passage continued beyond the obstruction. It was still usable. "We made it," Mira whispered with cautious hope. Daniel smiled, although he immediately noticed fresh cracks running across the remaining support beams. The tunnel would not survive another major collapse. They could not afford mistakes. He gently lowered Mira onto solid ground before removing a compact engineering toolkit from his backpack. "Give me a minute," he said. "I want to make sure this place stays standing while we pass through." Kneeling beside one of the damaged support columns, Daniel examined its fractured locking braces. Years spent repairing cargo stations and mining tunnels returned almost automatically. He tightened loose magnetic anchors, repositioned a damaged reinforcement plate, and secured everything with industrial repair foam from the emergency kit. It was not perfect. It was not permanent. It only needed to last long enough. Elio watched every movement with growing curiosity. "You fix things," the boy said quietly. Daniel chuckled without looking up. "Usually engines. Can you fix buildings too?" Daniel finally stood and brushed gray dust from his gloves. "Sometimes keeping people safe starts with fixing whatever is right in front of you." Elio considered those words carefully before nodding to himself. The scanner vibrated once more. 1.9 miles. 28 minutes. Daniel looked toward the dark passage stretching beneath the mountain. The tunnel map stored in his wrist computer showed nearly 3/4 of a mile before reaching the opposite side. If the route remained clear, they might gain precious time. If not, they would be trapped underground. He chose not to share either possibility. "Stay close enough to touch my backpack," he instructed. "If the lights go out, do not panic. Just keep following my voice." Mira reached for the back of his jacket. Elio stepped beside his sister. Together, they entered the tunnel. The outside wind disappeared almost instantly, replaced by cool, still air carrying the faint scent of damp stone and old machinery. Every footstep echoed ahead before fading into the darkness. Small emergency lights embedded along the walls flickered weakly, as if awakening after years of silence. Their pale glow illuminated faded maintenance markings, abandoned tool carts, and forgotten supply lockers coated in dust. Daniel kept scanning every intersection while counting the distance in his head. 100 yards. 200. 300. Then the ground trembled ever so slightly beneath their feet. Tiny grains of rock drifted from the ceiling. Somewhere behind them, far beyond the tunnel entrance, a long distant chorus rolled across the valley. Daniel stopped walking for only a second. He tightened his grip on the flashlight, drew one slow breath, and continued forward without looking back. The tunnel narrowed until Daniel could brush both walls with outstretched hands, the rough stone cool beneath his fingertips and damp with years of trapped moisture. Every few yards another faded maintenance light flickered overhead, throwing long shadows across abandoned pipes and rusted equipment that had not been touched in decades. Mira rested quietly against the side of his backpack now, her breathing slower after finally escaping the freezing wind outside, while Elio stayed only a step behind, carefully matching Daniel's pace exactly as he had been instructed. The silence inside the mountain should have felt comforting, yet it carried a different weight. It was the silence of a place that had been forgotten. Daniel glanced at his wrist scanner again. The display struggled to maintain a stable image beneath the layers of rock overhead, but one detail remained painfully clear. The moving signatures had reached the tunnel entrance. Distance, 0.1 miles. Signal interference detected. External tracking unavailable. Daniel exhaled slowly. They had lost the advantage of information. From this point forward, they would have to rely on instinct. A low vibration rolled through the stone beneath their boots, followed by another several seconds later. Tiny grains of dust drifted from the ceiling, sparkling briefly in the flashlight beam before settling on the floor. Mira tightened her grip around the shoulder strap of Daniel's pack. "Was that the mountain?" she whispered. Daniel looked upward for a moment before answering honestly. "Partly." He did not mention the other possibility. They continued deeper until the passage opened into an old maintenance junction where 4 corridors met beneath a circular ceiling nearly 30 feet above the floor. Broken utility carts rested against one wall beside stacks of weathered supply crates covered in faded warning symbols. Daniel immediately recognized the room's purpose. Repair crews had once gathered here before traveling into different sections of the underground network. More importantly, the chamber still contained functioning emergency equipment. He searched quickly through the abandoned storage lockers until he found several portable power cells, a heavy industrial cable, reflective warning panels, and 2 compact construction beacons. None of them were weapons. That was not what Daniel saw. He saw tools. Tools solve problems. They always had. Kneeling beside the nearest corridor entrance, he connected one power cell to a maintenance beacon and adjusted the output frequency until the small device emitted a bright, pulsing light accompanied by a steady electronic tone. He carried it nearly 100 feet down the left passage before securing it behind a damaged support beam. Returning to the junction, he repeated the process with the second beacon in another corridor leading away from their intended route. Elio watched carefully. "Why are you putting the lights over there?" Daniel smiled while coiling the remaining industrial cable over one shoulder. "Because sometimes surviving is not about running faster." He tightened the final connector. "Sometimes it is about making the wrong path look more interesting than the right one." Elio's eyes widened with understanding. "You are making a distraction." "Exactly." Daniel rose and slung the cable across his back. Years of repairing freight systems had taught him that machines usually followed predictable signals. Whatever pursued them had demonstrated organized movement across the valley. If it reacted to sound, vibration, or light. Even a few minutes of confusion could mean the difference between reaching the far exit or remaining trapped underground. Another tremor rippled through the chamber. This one lasted longer. Somewhere beyond the maze of tunnels came the faint metallic echo of something striking old support beams in slow, rhythmic intervals. Daniel switched off his flashlight for a brief second. Complete darkness swallowed everything. Then he turned the beam back on. "Stay close," he said quietly. "We still have a way out." Without hesitation, Mira reached for his hand. Elio stepped beside his sister, and together they disappeared into the only corridor that still remained completely dark. The narrow corridor curved gently upward, and after what felt like an endless walk, the air began to change. It no longer carried only the cold smell of damp stone and forgotten machinery. There was fresh wind somewhere ahead. Daniel noticed it immediately. A faint current brushed across his face, carrying the clean scent of frozen grass and distant rain. An exit. He slowed his pace instead of rushing forward. Experience had taught him that the final 100 feet often demanded more caution than the first 10 miles. The flashlight beam swept across the walls until it caught a faded maintenance map bolted to the rock. Most of the lettering had disappeared beneath years of dust, but one detail remained readable. Emergency surface access. 600 feet. Daniel allowed himself a quiet breath of relief. "We are almost there," he whispered. Mira smiled against his shoulder while Elio looked ahead with renewed determination. The boy had stopped asking whether they would make it. He simply kept walking. That alone told Daniel how much trust had grown between them in only a few hours. Another distant vibration rolled through the passage, softer now because of the many layers of stone surrounding them. Then came something unexpected. The electronic beacons Daniel had placed behind them continued pulsing through the tunnel network. Their steady rhythm echoed from several directions at once, creating overlapping signals that bounced between the walls. Daniel pictured the maze in his mind. If anything was following those lights and sounds, it would have to choose between multiple paths. Every minute gained mattered. They reached a heavy blast door, standing half open beneath a cracked emergency light. The hydraulic system had failed long ago, leaving the thick steel panel frozen in place. Only a narrow opening remained between the door and its frame. Daniel tested the gap with one shoulder before carefully sliding his backpack through first. "One at a time," he said. Elio slipped through easily. Mira giggled softly when Daniel gently guided her through the narrow space. Finally, he squeezed through himself, his jacket catching briefly on the rough metal before coming free with a sharp tearing sound. The chamber beyond was larger than anything they had seen underground. A massive ventilation room stretched across nearly half a football field, filled with silent turbines, rusted catwalks, and rows of enormous ventilation ducts reaching toward the ceiling. High above them, daylight filtered through broken skylights in pale silver beams, illuminating tiny particles of dust drifting through the still air. Daniel immediately spotted the surface ladder attached to the far wall. It climbed nearly 40 feet toward a circular hatch standing slightly open beneath the evening sky. "There," he said, pointing upward. "That is our way out." Hope returned almost instantly. Even Elio broke into a run before stopping himself and looking back toward Daniel for permission. Daniel nodded with a smile. "Go ahead, but stay where I can see you." As the children hurried across the old metal floor, Daniel remained behind for one brief moment. His eyes moved across the vast chamber, measuring distances, studying old machinery, noticing details that most people would ignore. One enormous ventilation fan still had power connected to it. Not enough to spin continuously, but enough to respond if manually activated. Beside the control panel rested thick industrial cables leading into the tunnel network behind them. Daniel looked from the cables to the distant doorway they had just crossed, then back to the ladder. His expression slowly changed. An engineer rarely saw obstacles. Engineers saw possibilities. Quietly, without alarming either child, he walked toward the dormant control console and brushed decades of dust away from its weathered surface. A single green indicator blinked weakly beneath his fingertips. The system was not dead after all. It was simply waiting for someone who understood how to wake it up. Daniel ran one gloved hand across the dusty control panel until faded lettering slowly emerged beneath his fingertips. Auxiliary ventilation override. Manual power transfer required. He smiled despite the fatigue pulling at every muscle in his body. It was old technology, the kind built long before elegant automation replaced mechanical reliability. Old machines were honest. If they still had power, they usually told you exactly what they needed. Daniel opened the maintenance compartment below the console and found a tangled cluster of heavy electrical connectors covered in years of dust. Several had broken loose during the earlier collapse. He removed a compact multi-tool from his belt and began reconnecting them one by one, listening carefully to the faint clicks that echoed through the silent chamber. Behind him, Elio and Mira had reached the base of the ladder. The boy looked back nervously. "Should we climb now?" Daniel glanced toward the hatch nearly 40 feet above. Pale evening light spilled through the opening, carrying fresh air into the room. Freedom was close enough to feel. "Not yet," Daniel answered calmly. "Give me just another minute." Mira tilted her head. "Why?" Daniel tightened the final connector before looking at the children with the same reassuring smile he had worn since meeting them. "Because I want to make sure nothing follows us." A quiet hum spread through the old machinery beneath his hands. One green indicator became 2, then 3. Deep inside the ventilation network, ancient motors awakened with a low mechanical groan that rolled through the chamber like distant thunder. Massive fan blades hidden beyond the walls began turning slowly for the first time in decades. Dust lifted from the floor in gentle spirals as fresh air rushed through forgotten tunnels. Daniel watched the pressure gauges climb until they reached the yellow operating range. Good enough. He adjusted several airflow valves, redirecting nearly all available pressure toward the maintenance corridors they had crossed earlier. The fans did not need to run forever, only long enough. Suddenly, the entire chamber trembled. Not violently, but enough for loose bolts to rattle across nearby catwalks. Another vibration followed only seconds later. This time, even Elio felt it. "They are close," the boy whispered. Daniel did not argue. He already knew. The old ventilation sensors had begun receiving external interference. Small warning lights blinked across the control panel, tracing movement somewhere inside the tunnel system. The distraction beacons had bought valuable time, but time was running out. Daniel reached for the large red activation lever mounted beside the console. He paused for one final inspection of the pressure readings before pulling it firmly downward. Somewhere beyond the chamber, hidden deep inside the maze of maintenance passages, powerful streams of compressed air burst through emergency ducts that had remained sealed for years. The resulting roar echoed through the mountain with astonishing force, carrying dust, loose debris, and deafening noise into dozens of abandoned corridors at once. The sound rolled away from their position, spreading in every direction like an artificial storm. Daniel nodded with quiet satisfaction. Now every empty tunnel sounds more interesting than this one. Elio stared at him with open admiration. "You planned that?" Daniel shrugged as though it were nothing extraordinary. "I repair ventilation systems for a living." Mira laughed softly. "Humans fix very strange things. Sometimes strange things become useful." He slung the backpack securely over both shoulders and walked toward the ladder. The fresh wind pouring through the open hatch felt stronger now, carrying the scent of pine like trees growing somewhere beyond the ridge. Daniel placed one boot on the first rung and motioned for Elio to climb ahead. Mira followed next while Daniel remained below them, one hand resting against the ladder, his eyes never leaving the chamber behind. The machinery continued humming steadily, filling the underground complex with echoing currents of sound. Whether it would be enough, he could not know. But as the children climbed toward the fading daylight above, Daniel realized something had quietly changed inside him. Hours earlier, they had been strangers. Now, without ever speaking the words aloud, they had become his responsibility, and there was nothing in the galaxy he would allow to change that. The last few rungs seemed to stretch forever. Elio reached the circular hatch first and pushed with both hands until the heavy metal cover swung open with a tired groan. Fresh evening air poured into the shaft, cool and clean, carrying the distant sound of wind moving through tall blue trees. Mira climbed out next, blinking beneath the fading light as the open sky welcomed them for the first time in hours. Daniel remained several feet below, listening instead of climbing. The ventilation system continued roaring beneath the mountain, sending powerful currents through abandoned tunnels exactly as he had intended. Then, almost imperceptibly, the echoes began to change. Some passages fell silent, while others carried the growing sound farther away from their position. He smiled to himself. The diversion had worked longer than he had expected, at least for now. He climbed the final steps and pulled himself onto solid ground beside the children. The mountain ridge overlooked an immense valley painted silver by the setting sun. Jagged cliffs surrounded fields of shimmering grass that bent gracefully beneath the evening breeze. In the distance, broken structures marked where a thriving settlement had once stood, their outlines softened by mist rising from the cooling earth. Daniel took one slow breath. They had escaped the tunnels. That alone felt like a small miracle. Mira stepped closer to the cliff's edge before suddenly pointing toward the horizon. "Look!" Daniel followed her gaze. At first he saw only clouds glowing gold beneath the setting sun. Then tiny points of white light appeared above them. 1 became 3. 3 became 10. Within seconds, dozens of brilliant streaks crossed the sky in perfect formation, descending silently through the atmosphere. Daniel's tired eyes narrowed. Those were not meteors. They were ships. Elio's breathing caught. "Our people." The boy whispered the words with such certainty that Daniel did not question him. High above the valley, sleek silver vessels emerged from the clouds one after another, their polished hulls reflecting the last light of day. They moved with disciplined precision, slowing as they approached the damaged settlement below. Gentle blue beams swept across the landscape in wide arcs, scanning the ground without a single wasted motion. Daniel instinctively reached for the emergency beacon clipped to his belt. Its battery had barely enough charge remaining for one transmission. He pressed the activation switch. A faint green pulse rose into the evening sky before stabilizing into a narrow column of light. "Come on," he murmured almost silently. "See us." Seconds passed. Then one of the distant ships altered course. Another followed. Soon an entire group separated from the main formation and began moving directly toward the ridge. Mira looked up at Daniel, her golden eyes shining with hope stronger than anything words could express. "They found us." Daniel smiled, but fatigue finally caught up with him. The endless walking, the tension, the constant decisions, and the weight of responsibility settled onto his shoulders all at once. He lowered himself onto a smooth rock, removing the heavy backpack with a quiet sigh. Elio immediately sat beside him, while Mira carefully folded one of the thermal blankets over Daniel's shoulders exactly as he had done for her earlier. "You are cold," she said simply. Daniel laughed softly. "Maybe a little. Mom always says people who protect others forget to protect themselves." Daniel looked toward the approaching ships again, their bright running lights growing larger against the darkening sky. "Your mom sounds wiser every time I hear about her." None of them noticed the lead vessel slowing before it landed. None of them saw the elegant blue figure standing inside the open ramp long before it touched the ground. She had already recognized 2 small silhouettes standing beside a tired human who had never once asked who they were. She only knew that they were alive. The landing ramp touched the rocky ground without a sound. Rows of uniformed alien guardians stepped aside instead of rushing forward, leaving a clear path for the tall blue-skinned woman walking between them. Her silver-blue cloak moved gently in the evening wind, and the fading sunlight reflected in her golden eyes before she ever reached the children. Elio ran first. "Mom!" The single word echoed across the quiet ridge. Mira followed only a heartbeat later, dropping her stuffed toy for the first time since Daniel had found her beneath the broken cargo containers. The woman fell to one knee and wrapped both children in her arms, closing her eyes as though she needed to feel their heartbeat before believing they were truly there. No speeches followed. No grand declarations. Only silence, broken by quiet breaths of relief. Daniel looked away, giving the family the privacy they deserved. He busied himself by tightening the strap on his backpack and checking the cracked display on his engineering scanner one last time before switching it off forever. Its screen had gone completely dark. The battery had finally surrendered. "So did mine," he whispered with a tired smile, speaking more to himself than anyone else. Soft footsteps approached across the stone. Daniel looked up as the alien woman stopped a few feet away. Up close, she carried herself with quiet authority rather than pride. Her uniform bore silver insignias unlike anything Daniel had seen before, and behind her every member of the landing party remained perfectly still, waiting without interrupting the moment. She studied him for several long seconds before speaking. "I am Lyra Valus." Her voice was calm, yet emotion rested beneath every word. "Those children are my son and daughter." Daniel blinked once. He glanced toward Elio and Mira, now standing safely beside their mother, then back at Lyra. "I did not know." "I know." She stepped closer. "You never asked who they were." Daniel shrugged lightly. "They were scared kids." That seemed important enough. Something changed in Lyra's expression. It was almost invisible, but every officer standing behind her noticed it immediately. The distance between commander and grateful mother disappeared in a single heartbeat. She slowly reached to the collar of her uniform and removed a slender silver ring woven into a simple chain. The metal caught the last rays of sunlight, revealing delicate symbols engraved across its surface. She held it carefully in both hands before extending it toward Daniel. "Among my people," she said softly, "this is given only to someone whose courage becomes part of our family forever." Daniel stared at the small silver emblem without moving. "I cannot accept something that belongs to you." Lyra smiled for the first time. "It no longer belongs to me." Before Daniel could answer, she gently placed the chain around his neck. The silver rested against his weathered jacket with surprising simplicity. No music played. No applause followed. Yet behind Lyra, every guardian lowered their head in silent respect. Daniel looked around in complete confusion. "You really do not have to do all this," he said quietly. "I only helped." Elio stepped forward and smiled. "That is why you deserve it." Mira picked up her worn stuffed toy and slipped the small blue scarf Daniel had rescued from the abandoned valley into one of its tiny stitched pockets. "Now we both have something to remember," she whispered. Far above them, the stars slowly appeared one by one across the darkening sky, while rescue ships lifted peacefully into orbit. Months later, historians would record the evacuation as another successful military operation. Engineers would write reports about damaged infrastructure. Politicians would debate strategies and resources. None of those records would mention the folded blue scarf inside a child's toy or the tired human engineer who never asked for recognition. Yet among the Valari people, children would grow up hearing a different story. It ended with a single sentence repeated from one generation to the next. In a galaxy where many measured strength by power, one ordinary human proved that the greatest courage was simply refusing to leave a child behind.